life and been hospitalized for depression, it can be as high as 10 to 15%. So 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people die by suicide if they've been an inpatient and hospitalized for depression. But of course it's not inevitable. Most people don't die in this way, but it's always a tragedy when it happens for the family left behind and for the friends and colleagues of the person.
Is suicide always linked with depression?
It's the most closely linked problem, so that even, I mean, you get elevated risk of suicide in other mental health problems like schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder, but it's the depressive aspect of schizophrenia. So many people can survive, as it were, having serious mental health problems in an amazingly courageous way, but depression takes away that hope. And it's when hopelessness comes, which tends to come with depression, that actually people become at greater risk of suicide. Whatever the condition it is, it's the occurrence of depression that accounts for that.
Do people tend to kill themselves as they come out of a depression rather than when they actually have the kind of hopelessness and the lack of energy when they're in the teeth of a depression?
There's quite a lot of clinical evidence for that. It's never been proven by research. It's a very difficult thing to prove, but many people have said that they thought that the person was actually feeling happier now, and the natural inference is exactly as you suggest, that people, when they're very, very depressed, actually have very little energy, and that it's when the energy starts to come back, but the mood has not yet improved, that is a very dangerous time. It's also true to say that some of the big studies that Lewis Appleby and others have done in the United Kingdom have found that the most vulnerable time is a time just after discharge from hospital, for example, after a change in medication, which very often reflected the fact that their physician thought they were feeling better. So that's also indications that when people are on the mend and people around them think they can stand on their own 2 feet, almost that transition is a very difficult time for people. You were mentioning about the close links between depression and suicide and asking about that, and somebody's calculated actually how much of the suicide risk in the world could be eliminated if we could eliminate depression, and it turns out to be about 80%. Because of the very close association. People don't tend to be suicidal outside an episode of depression. Depression is the thing that is as it were, the final common pathway, depression and hopelessness. And one of the interesting things that's emerged in the last few years is that when you get repeated depressions, you can get depressed again and again, but different symptoms can be there each time, so that always those core symptoms seem to be there, like low mood and lack of interest. But the other things like weight loss, sleep loss, guilt, they may or may not be there. But our research in Oxford has found that of all the symptoms that recur when depression recurs, suicidal feelings are the most recurrent. And of course that's important clinically to realise, because it means that often doctors will ask somebody who's depressed whether they feel suicidal. Well, that's an important question to ask, but it's more important to ask, did you feel suicidal when you were last depressed? Because if people felt suicidal at their worst ever time, then there's some chances that during this episode, at some point, they're going to feel suicidal. So clinically it's important, and research-wise it's important to get to the bottom of what are the characteristics of recurrence so we can begin to help.
So what exactly does a full-blown depression feel like?
It's a combination of experiences, of distortions, you might say, in the way you think, the way you feel, the body and your impulses. So if you take each in turn, your thoughts are dominated by ideas of helplessness, rejection, being a failure, not being good enough, not being worth your space in the world. You feel like the lowest of the low, and that nobody wants you, nobody likes you, and that even if they do like you, that's because they haven't found out the truth about you, you're just a fraud, and as soon as they find out what you're really like, they'll reject you. So your thoughts are dominated by that. That becomes a habit So that although many of us might think like that for, once or twice a day or a week or a month, in depression, it's just like comes all the time. I mean, many of us know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night, for example, and not be able to get back to sleep, and our thoughts go round and round and round. We just ruminate and brood. Well, depression is like that sort of middle of the night thinking, but it happens during the day as well. Secondly, your feelings get bombarded. There's feelings of sadness, of hopelessness, of worthlessness, and they're very closely tied in with your thoughts. If you can imagine somebody standing behind you all day saying how useless you were, then sooner or later you'd feel sad, irritable, run down, exhausted, and a miserable failure. And that's the way in which the feelings reflect those thoughts. It's not just a mental thing. Your body slows down, you lack energy, your body fails to work in an efficient way, so you don't sleep well, you don't eat well, and this itself feeds back into your sense of fatigue and slowness, lack of energy, either being in some cases very agitated, in some cases being very, very slowed down, and so that's the way the body. I mean, if you look at the way people walk when they're depressed, for example, their gait is very different. Not as it were walking upright, walking slouched, going from side to side instead of actually more steady on their feet. And lastly, your behaviour is affected. You don't. Either you feel like you feel suicidal, but also you feel like withdrawing from the world. And that sense of withdrawal, of not wanting to see things. Now, once again, most of us have had times in our life when the phone rang and we thought, oh, no, do I have to answer that? Or when we didn't want to get up in the morning and anybody could have seen we were, quite sort of withdrawn. But that goes on relentlessly. It feels like it goes on relentlessly in depression. And when you put these together, the thoughts, the feelings, these body changes and your impulse to act or your behavioural tendency to withdraw, then that is what drags you down. It's not surprising then that people feel the burden and can't function when they've got all of this going on in their life.
So is there any one thing that drives people or tips people over the edge from normal run-of-the-mill sadnesses or periods of rumination or reflection into a period of full-blooded depression?
There are, and actually I'd like to tackle that in greater detail in later episodes, because it's exactly what tips people into other episodes that the research is most exciting over the last 20 or 30 years. And out of that comes the interest in mindfulness research. So that's something that I think we'll be able to go into detail in future episodes.
So that implies it is possible to stop a depression from, or rather, normal feelings of unhappiness that we all experience from day to day. It's possible to stop that and prevent it from tipping over the edge into a clinical depression.
That's the most exciting development in the last 20 years, and the way in which mindfulness is able to help people to notice when the tipping point is coming and allow you to deal with what you've got then without going down into the depths is, I think, one of the major things.
And that must have huge clinical relevance.
It's got huge clinical relevance, because if we could find, and I'll describe that in the later episode, if we can find that this is actually as useful as antidepressants or as other treatments, it's of global significance, because it doesn't depend on medications which in some contexts are just too expensive for people to purchase.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. In this episode, we were talking about the new psychology of depression and what exactly depression is. And in the next episode, we'll be talking about the major treatments for depression and how they've changed over the last century or so. For further information about the issues raised in this programme, you can read The Mindful Way Through Depression by Professor Mark Williams and his co-workers, or you could read our book, Mindfulness, Finding Peace in a Frantic World, by Mark Williams and me, Danny Penman, or you could visit our website, franticworld.com. If you'd like to support further research in this area, you could visit oxfordmindfulness.org, that's all one word, and follow the links to the development campaign.